Welcome to another episode of the Cannabis Review. I am delighted to be joined on this episode by Matt Lemairs. He is the International Cannabis Markets Correspondent for MJ Biz. How are you keeping, Matty? Well?
Very well, thank you. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Delighted to have you on, mate. I've been following all your articles regularly. You're one of the great sources of information in the industry. Do you want to basically maybe give everybody a quick little overview of how you got into the industry and where you are at MJ Biz?
Sure, yeah, just briefly, I guess. I've been a journalist for almost 20 years. Actually, I'm Canadian, but I grew up outside of Canada for a lot of my adult life, and I moved back to Canada about 4 years ago, specifically to take this job, to be the international editor for MJ Biz. So I live near Toronto here.
Okay, amazing. And how do you think the industry's grown so quickly in the time that you've been in it? Do you see the media side of things starting to ramp up a little bit more? That seems to be the slowest side of the industry I've seen so far.
I think the media side grew too fast. Speaking in Canada anyways, the media grew faster than the actual industry in 2018 and 2019. So unfortunately, quite a few cannabis journalists lost their jobs, which is really sad, right? So there were a lot of people reporting on this industry a few years ago, but there's not very many of us left in Canada. The industry needs more reporters, right? It needs more light than ever shine. It needs a lot of analysis. It needs just rigorous analysis, and that's kind of one thing that might be missing in other countries. In Canada, we have a bunch of journalists doing this, but I'm not sure how many dedicated journalists are reporting on the cannabis industry in Europe or in Australia. They probably need more.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And let's hope we see a lot of people take up the baton now over here, because you're starting to see the momentum in Europe. I'm going to kick things off with the first topic of conversation, and it's the fate of the Canadian LPs. It's been a roller coaster. Even as of 18 hours ago, the stock seemed to be soaring by the news from Amazon. How do you see the fate of the Canadian LPs? Do you see them devouring each other until there's just one dominant company? Or do you see the mergers that have happened recently then being able to just compete for market competition themselves?
Well, that's a great question. Firstly, though, I would warn people against tracking the stock market and concluding that that's kind of a barometer for the health of companies. The stock market and the health of cannabis companies are not connected at all. And we've seen that in the last 5 years, when all the cannabis companies in Canada that were publicly traded soared in valuation, even though they had no fundamental reason to do so. So I don't follow the stock market very much. I check in on cannabis stocks approximately once a month, maybe less. I never report on it. It's a distraction. It's noise, and it's not helpful for businesses or for investors, because, like I said, the fundamentals of the companies are so separated from how they're actually performing from the stock market. There's no correlation at all. So I think that you need to really get to know who's on the board of directors. You need to get to know the CEO, and when I say get to know, I don't mean picking up the phone and calling them and talking to him. I mean, reading up on his background. Like, has the CEO ever done this before? What does the board of directors look like? Does the board of directors have people who have been successful in their careers in this industry or an adjacent industry in the past? And for most companies, the answer is no. Like, most companies are led by CEOs who have just never done this before. Their boards of directors have people who have never done this before, and you see them struggling now. But I'll say there's one thing that doesn't apply to is founders. Okay, so if you're going to found a cannabis company, that doesn't mean you don't know what you're doing. But at some point, the founder has to step aside for someone who has done that before to bring the company to the next stage. And that's something that almost all the Canadian LPs failed to do. Most of the founders stuck around for years too long. So I don't even have to say the names here. We all know who they are, right? They stuck around too long, and now their companies have lost billions of dollars. That was one of the key mistakes they made.
Yeah, no, I agree. One of the voices I love listening to the most in the industry is a guy called Rob McPherson. I think he's based out of Canada as well. And he always makes the point that a lot of these companies are in the consumer goods business. They're not in the cannabis industry, and stocking your board or having the expertise of consumer goods makes complete sense. But when you look at the leadership in the companies, there's pretty much little to no people who have actual experience in these exact industries that they're trying to target, which kind of leads me into this next topic now, leadership in cannabis. Give me the top 3 qualities you think a CEO for a cannabis company need. And it's not the founder now, the person that the founder should be bringing in to run the ship. What are the top 3 qualities you think they should have?
Well, first he or she has to be, they have to have a vision. So you can't just come in, even if you're an experienced CPG executive, you can't just come in and run your cannabis company like you would any other CPG company without any kind of vision. Like, what's your goal? You know, what customers are you looking for? Are you looking to delight? You can't be looking to delight everyone, and that's another mistake a lot of businesses make here in this industry, is that they're like, oh, we want to be the market share leader, but what market exactly? You know, you can't just want to be the Canadian market share leader without specifying which customers in Canada specifically you want to meet demand for, because you can't meet demand for everybody. If you do, you'll try and lose. So you have to have a vision, a very specific vision. You have to be disciplined, I think, is the most important one. And that's something we haven't seen much of. I say maybe in 2018 to 2020, maybe lately we have, like a lot of CEOs now, they do have the discipline probably that they needed a couple of years ago. So rather than pulling the trigger on that $800 million M&A, you got to step back and be like, what's this really going to accomplish for my company? Should I pay $800 million for this company that has no revenue? Is that really a good idea? Probably not. I mean, the third one, I don't know. The first 2 are probably the most important. The third one, I don't know. Maybe you need to be a little bit flexible and adaptable in how you're planning your business. Because if you're just going to bank on one market, you might get burned. Although when I say that out loud, it doesn't sound that great, because what you need to do if you're an executive is you really need to focus on where you can actually make money, real money. Like, where are the real markets today? Not the markets that are in your investor deck. So a lot of companies, a lot of publicly traded companies will have a slide in their investor deck that says there's a global opportunity that's $300 or $400 billion. But that's not real, right? That's not accessible. Like, none of that is accessible to your business. So why is it in your investor deck? So maybe the third most important thing is just that you have to be realistic and be honest with yourself and your investors, because that $300 billion slide in your investor deck is not honest with yourself or your investors. It's not real. It's fake. I don't even think it should be legal, to be honest with you, because 99% of that market isn't addressable for the business. So why is it there? Why are you even talking about it? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I agree. I completely agree with you. That's one thing in Europe we're lacking now, is good financial analysis and reports of the industry. Over here, you get a lot of the usual. The industry will be worth 100 billion by 2024, but realistically, like, it's not 2024 now. We want to know what it can do now for the investor and for the entrepreneur setting up the company and for the consumer. I'm going to end with the last topic, which is basically M&As in 2021. Do you think this is the year where we're going to see most of the M&As, or do you think the US having a nationwide industry will be, that year that happens will be the real year of M&As? And what's your thoughts on the Hexo Redcan deal?
Just broadly, I guess in Canada, all of the LPs are talking to each other about M&A. Like, everyone's talking to everyone. But what's slowing it down, I guess, is that there's not a lot of successful LPs, right? Like, a lot of them are struggling. There's some successful LPs, but they're the quiet ones. And I think earlier you asked about traits of CEO, and I would say that the most successful CEOs that I've seen in Canada are the quietest ones, and that's usually the guys that are privately owned, right? The publicly traded CEOs are usually noisy, and they're doing interviews. They're on MSNBC and they're on Bloomberg all the time, but I think that's mostly a distraction for people. So I think, get down to business and just run your business rather than trying to talk about your stock so much. That was a big distraction for companies for years. So what was your question again?
Basically, do you think that 2021 is going to be the M&As, or do you think like when the states basically have statewide access and the big boys in there start gobbling up the competition, do you see that year that happens is going to blitz the year that we're having so far? Because there's been
I don't know. It's a really good question, but it's hard to say because it's also dependent on what happens in Congress, right? There's I guess M&A in the U.S. is slowly picking up, but it's not really picking up as much as you might expect it should be, because, and that makes sense, because if you're a CEO of a big American cannabis company, investing a lot of money in another business comes with the risk that your investment might be moot a year from now, depending on how the U.S. legalizes cannabis and depending on what regulations come into place. So you're kind of taking a big risk right now if you're spending a lot of money on M&A in the States. The business you buy could be useless 1 or 2 years from now. But at the same time, maybe you might be getting a pretty good deal on that M&A because it might be a lot more expensive in a couple of years when you know what the regulatory landscape is going to look like. In Canada, it's a little bit different. The regulatory landscape is pretty settled. The problem is we don't have a lot of successful LPs, and competition is so cutthroat that a lot of M&A just isn't happening right now. In terms of Hexo's deal for Redecan or Redecan, I think that was a great deal because there weren't a lot of LPs in Canada that grew their market share in 2020. Actually, I should take that back. There were quite a few, but they were the smaller ones. But Redecan was probably one of the few large LPs that expanded its market share. And I think their market share doubled. I'm going off memory here, but I think it was approximately 3 or 4% to 7 or 8%. And that's a pretty significant portion of the market. It's a successful company that's probably profitable, that expanded its market share. It has loyal customers. It has a good reputation. It was a great acquisition by Hexo. I'll go out on a limb and say it was probably the best acquisition by a Canadian LP in the last 3 or 4 years. Because how many LPs can claim to have bought another LP that was profitable and that's growing market share? Not very many. None come to mind right now, but there might have been a couple, right? So I think that was a great deal. Was it expensive at almost $1 billion? It was really expensive, but like I said, the company's growing, so I think it's worth it. The other 2 deals that Sebastian made were a little bit risky. So I wonder because he also bought a couple of smaller LPs this year. And so I wonder if he would have pulled the trigger on those 2 smaller M&As if he had known that this deal with Redecan was going to go through. But, I give Sebastian credit because he's going for it in Canada. He wants to be the biggest, he wants to be among the top 3 LPs in Canada, and he's going for it. Whereas companies like Tilray and Canopy, I'm not going to say they're ignoring the Canadian market, but they really have their focus squarely on the US market and the European market, which is extremely risky. And I don't invest in stocks. But if I did, I think I would probably bet on the company that had a higher probability of success in a market that's defined. And I wouldn't
somebody
say
like
the
Next
US,
Leaf or somebody like that who's getting all the patents going.
yeah, right. So they have a defined market, right? They know who their customers are, and but I wouldn't say the U.S. market is defined yet because we don't know what the rules and regulations are going to look like. And the rules and the regulations kind of set the boundaries for where businesses can compete in, and they also set the limit for where the market, the legal market, can reach. And in Canada, for example, you couldn't sell edibles in the first year. So basically for the first 2 years, really. But so the limit of the market, the ceiling was relatively low. But now that we're getting more and more products, the ceiling for this market is growing. The European market, there's more that's unknown than that's known. So every business that's participating in the European market is taking a massive risk. But I think everyone knows that, although I don't think most investors realize that. The executives sure are aware of that, though. Look at even Denmark, for example. The Denmark market was doing very well in 2019, in 2018 and 2019, and then just fell off a cliff in 2020 because regulators, I'm not going to say they stopped caring, but they took their eye off the ball. And it's an example of, if you're competing in a regulated medical marijuana market, what your regulator is doing is absolutely essential. So for some reason, the Danish regulators kind of started promoting this bizarre export strategy for the country. So you have this weird situation in Denmark now where Danish producers are selling medical marijuana that was made in Denmark, in Germany, and there's no locally made medical marijuana in Denmark. So they have only like 500 or 600 customers in the last quarter, which is nothing. It's a drop in the bucket, right? So it's just a sign that the local population is just completely ignoring that pilot scheme. It's just an example of how regulations can be extremely risky in a hyper regulated market like medical marijuana. And another point I want to make in terms of the global cannabis industry, to put things in perspective, just getting a little bit off topic, but I think this is important. We're very, very early in this medical marijuana. I'm not going to call it an experiment, but in the medical marijuana and the growth of the global medical marijuana industry. If you look look at it, Australia, for example. Their market was only worth $100 million last year. $100 million divided by dozens of companies competing for that $100 million, and there's not much left over, right? Which is why you have so many companies that are losing money right now in Australia and in Canada. It's the same situation. But to put that into perspective, like how young is the global medical marijuana market in Australia and Germany, everywhere? The Canadian military reimbursed their veterans about 120 million Canadian dollars last year. That is more money than was spent in all of Australia's medical marijuana market. So the Canadian military, if it was a country, would be one of the biggest medical marijuana markets in the world. Now, that's not saying the Canadian military is spending too much money, because they would either be reimbursing veterans for medical marijuana or they would be reimbursing them for opiates. So obviously, medical marijuana is better for you than opiates. Everyone knows that, who looks into it. It's just an example of how young the industry is and how much potential there is for growth in Australia and Germany and elsewhere. The Canadian military reimbursed their veterans something like 14,000 kilograms of medical marijuana last year, which is more than the entire European regulated medical marijuana industry for unapproved medical marijuana. So there's room for growth, tons of room for growth, but people have to be aware of how early we are in this, and things are going to go wrong, like in Denmark. Overall, things are going to go wrong. Things are going to rise probably, right? You can only assume that, but you have to plan for setbacks. If you're a business, if you're an investor, you're not going to count on perpetual growth. It's not going to happen. It's impossible. Canada's been doing this for over 20 years. So Canada has the biggest regulated, federally regulated medical marijuana market in the world. But it's taken us 20 years to get to this point. So a country that legalizes medical marijuana, let's just say, for example, I know France is doing an experiment, but say they end the experiment tomorrow and they're like, screw the experiment, we're just going to legalize medical marijuana and we're going to regulate it. It's still going to take over 10 years for that market to develop and to grow and to even come close to its potential. So all of these forecasts that the European medical marijuana market are unregulated, so for regulated, unapproved medical marijuana is going to be some crazy number by 2024. Like, none of those predictions are going to be accurate. They're all going to be wrong.
Yeah, no, I agree. Very wise words. I'm going to end it there. For everybody who wants to check out Matt's work, check out mjbizdaily.com. Matt, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. I hope we can talk again in the future and dissect everything and see how everything turns out. Because from somebody who's been talking to everybody in Europe, things are going to ramp up pretty quickly here, and it'll be it should be a good old ride. So your input would be valuable on that. So have a great day, mate, and thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thanks a lot for having me. I appreciate it.